Welcome to today's Explainer. When we think about the Declaration of Independence, we usually picture this dusty old piece of parchment sitting behind thick glass. It feels like the static relic of history. But if you actually sit down and look at the structure and the words, what we're really looking at is the ultimate, meticulously structured breakup letter. Written directly to King George III, it is an absolute masterclass in building a logical, unassailable argument for why a relationship, in this case the political ties between the 13 American colonies and Great Britain, simply had to end. Okay, let's dive into this and deconstruct this incredible 1776 document. We're going to cover 1. The breaking point, 2. The philosophical justification, 3. The indictment of a king, 4. The formal declaration, and finally, 5. An enduring legacy. All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the breaking point. So it's absolutely crucial to understand that this separation wasn't just some sudden, overnight tantrum by the colonies. It was the boiling point of a pressure cooker that had been heating up for over a decade. If we trace the timeline, you see a really rapid escalation. Throughout the 1760s and 70s, the British Parliament was passing all these taxes and laws like the Stamp Act, which sparked massive protests, including the famous Boston Tea Party. But by April 1775, this wasn't just a debate about taxes anymore. Actual bloodshed happened with fighting at Lexington and Concord. The point of no return was coming up fast, and by June of 1776, Richard Henry Lee formally introduced a resolution for independence to the Continental Congress, which basically set the gears in motion for the official adoption of our document in July. To actually draft this justification to the rest of the world, the Second Continental Congress appointed a sort of all-star team, which became known as the Committee of Five. Thomas Jefferson, who was well known for his really eloquent writing style, was tasked as the primary author. But he definitely didn't do it alone. He had direct input, edits, and guidance from heavyweights like John Adams and Benjamin Franklin, along with Roger Sherman and Robert R. Livingston. They had a monumental job on their hands. Explain to a candid world exactly why they were taking this totally unprecedented step. Moving right along to Part 2, the philosophical justification. See, before Jefferson and the committee could just start listing off their specific complaints about the king, they needed to lay down their underlying philosophy of what a government should actually be. They had to do this to prove that Great Britain was violating those rules. And this resulted in arguably the most famous sentence in the English language. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. And this brilliantly illustrates the moral foundation for their entire argument. They're asserting that your rights don't come from a king, they don't come from a government, they are inherent, they're unalienable, meaning they literally cannot be taken away. Now, what's really fascinating is that these weren't brand new ideas. The drafters were heavily pulling from Enlightenment principles, specifically the writings of guys like John Locke. They were leaning on this concept of natural rights, which Jefferson famously phrased as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Furthermore, they relied on the whole idea of a social contract. Basically, this means a government only has power because the people being governed consent to give it that power in exchange for the government protecting their rights. So here's the kicker, the next logical step in their preamble. If a government is supposed to protect your rights, and it only gets its power from your consent, well, what happens when that government becomes destructive and tyrannical? The document explicitly states it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. They are arguing that throwing off a tyrant isn't just a legal right, it is a fundamental moral duty. Which brings us to Part 3, the indictment of a king. Look, if you're going to break up with an empire, you have to bring the receipts. Having established those philosophical ground rules, this section serves as the longest part of the Declaration, a massive detailed list of specific grievances proving that King George III was in fact acting as an absolute tyrant. They meticulously categorized his abuses. They accused him of obstructing justice and refusing to pass necessary laws. They called him out for keeping standing, armed British troops in the colonies during times of peace, totally without local consent. They cited the cutting off of global trade, the infamous imposing of taxes without consent, depriving colonists of a fair trial by jury, and ultimately waging a violent war against his own subjects. If you read the text, there's this incredible rhetorical power in how this section is structured. Over and over again, bullet point after bullet point, the paragraphs start with the exact same phrase. He has refused his assent to laws. He has dissolved representative houses. He has obstructed the administration of justice. It's a rapid-fire, relentless drumbeat, and it perfectly conveys the building, boiling frustration of the colonists. And the language escalates too. It goes from bureaucratic complaints to these visceral, violent realities. Just look at this vivid quote right from the text. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. This was no longer a theoretical disagreement over tax policy. This was a harsh physical conflict, and they were laying the cruelty and the devastation squarely at the feet of the British Crown. Let's move to part 4, the formal declaration. So, let's look at how this builds. They've shown the breaking point, they've explained the philosophy, and they've proven the king broke the contract. Now comes the dramatic final split. The conclusion officially changes the status of these 13 entities. It's a complete before and after. Before, they were united colonies, permanently tied to the British Crown and subject to its laws and whims. After this declaration, they assert themselves as free and independent states. They declare themselves completely absolved from all allegiance to Great Britain. And importantly, they claim sovereign powers on the world stage. The power to levy war, conclude peace, form alliances, and establish their own global commerce. But they knew full well the British Empire wasn't just going to let them walk away. And this leads to the haunting, incredibly heavy final sentence. We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. We really have to remember the incredible personal risk involved here. This wasn't some academic exercise. Under British law, this document was a literal, documented confession of high treason. If they lost the war, the men who signed this would be hanged, and all their wealth would be confiscated. And despite that massive risk, 56. That is the number of men who ultimately stepped forward to sign this document. Now, while the Continental Congress officially adopted the text on July 4th, it actually took some time to get the official parchment written up, so most of these 56 men affixed their signatures weeks later, primarily on August 2nd. And what's really striking is this unity this required right across the eastern seaboard. You have New Englanders like John Adams and John Hancock, who, famously signed his name the absolute largest. You have mid-Atlantic minds like Ben Franklin and Caesar Rodney. And you have Southern delegates like Thomas Jefferson and Richard Henry Lee. 13 distinct, often bickering colonies, united by region to put their names on this treasonous parchment, completely binding their fates together. And finally, part 5, an enduring legacy. So what happens after the breakup? How does a statement of principles penned way back in 1776 echo through the centuries? Well, the document carries a profoundly complex, dual legacy. On one hand, it's the staggering force for global liberty. It laid the ideological groundwork for the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. It sparked independence movements across the globe, from France to Latin America. Leaders like Abraham Lincoln viewed its core principles as an undeniable moral guide against tyranny. However, any objective reading must also acknowledge its time-bound contradictions. The bold claim that all men are created equal was written by a man who enslaved people in a society that upheld the institution of slavery. Furthermore, the text contains harsh, prejudiced language of its era, explicitly referring to Native Americans as merciless Indian savages in one of its specific grievances. It is a document of profound democratic ideals, but written by flawed men in a deeply unequal time. Today, the physical manifestation of all this history, the original engrossed parchment with those 56 signatures, it actually survives. It's carefully preserved and displayed at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., where millions of people go every year just to see the actual ink and paper that changed the course of history. So as we wrap up this explainer, we're left to consider the weight of these words way beyond their historical context. A government deriving its power solely from the consent of the governed, the inherent, unalienable rights of the individual. I want to leave you with this to reflect on. How do these foundational principles of liberty and consent continue to challenge, shape, and guide our modern society today? Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and keep asking the big questions.